In Seattle's Queen Anne district, they found 47 family photos spanning 3 decades. In each one, it got closer. Welcome to the Nightmare Maestro's archive, where tonight we explore how family traditions can hide the darkest secrets. November 1993 brought an unseasonably cold spell to Seattle's Queen Anne neighborhood, the kind that made the century-old Victorian houses creak and groan like living things. The Williams family maintained their Thanksgiving tradition despite the chill that seemed to seep through the walls of 1247 Highland Drive. Eleanor Williams, family matriarch, meticulously positioned her antique Polaroid camera on its brass tripod before the ornate fireplace, just as she had done every year since moving in during the summer of 1963. The fireplace dominated the room, its dark oak mantel looming above, carved with intricate patterns that Eleanor had never quite been able to decipher. Family photos in gilded frames adorned the mantel, each taken in exactly the same spot, though the faces had aged through the decades. The afternoon light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting prismatic patterns across the Persian rug, a family heirloom that had come with the house. Her son Ronald helped arrange the family. His wife Sharon, their teenage daughters Emma and Deborah in their matching burgundy dresses, Eleanor herself in her best pearl necklace, and Uncle James all in their holiday best. The camera's self-timer ticked away those precious 10 seconds as they smiled, the fireplace's warmth barely cutting through the peculiar cold spot that always seemed to manifest during their annual portrait. Sharon had complained about the cold spot earlier, suggesting they call someone to check the heating again. But Eleanor knew better. They'd had countless repairmen over the years, and none could explain why that one spot, right where they stood for photos, remained perpetually cold, even in summer. She'd grown used to it, like so many other quirks of the old house. The way the mirrors sometimes showed movements when no one was around, the persistent smell of tobacco in the library, though no one had smoked there in decades, the sound of footsteps in the empty third-floor hallway. That evening, as Eleanor added the new photo to the family album in her study, her hands trembled. Something about this year's picture felt wrong. The shadows behind them seemed deeper, more defined, almost like ink bleeding through paper. She found herself pulling out previous year's photos, spreading them across her antique mahogany desk, the wood surface reflecting the warm glow of her brass desk lamp. As she arranged them chronologically, her breath caught in her throat, fogging the glass of water she'd barely touched. Eleanor's arthritic fingers traced backward through time across the photographs, each one protected in its plastic sleeve. 1992, 1991, 1990. In each image, the family smiled warmly, but something else drew her attention. A darkness. Not just shadow, but something with form, with presence, with what appeared to be purpose. In the 1992 photo, it lurked by the grandfather clock, its shape barely distinguishable from the clock's mahogany case, but undeniably there. In 1991, it hovered near the heavy velvet curtains, their deep crimson folds seeming to embrace the dark figure. In 1990, it was barely visible in the corner, where the wallpaper's Victorian pattern created a perfect camouflage. Her reading glasses slipped down her nose as she leaned closer, the desk lamp casting yellow pools of light across each photograph. The images from the 1980s told their own story. 1985, a vague darkness behind Uncle James, almost appearing to rest a non-existent hand on his shoulder. 1983, the same figure, less distinct but unmistakably present, reflected in the mirror above the piano. 1980, a shadowy smudge near the doorway, positioned exactly where the grandfather clock would later stand. The 1970s photos revealed more subtle manifestations. 1975, the faintest suggestion of something in the mirror above the fireplace, like smoke caught in crystal. 1973, an odd distortion in the light streaming through the bay window, forming what could almost be a silhouette. 1970, a darkness between the family members that couldn't be explained by the camera's flash or the room's natural shadows. Eleanor's mind raced to rationalize what she was seeing, Light tricks, she told herself. Camera artifacts. Different cameras, different lighting conditions, different times of day, surely that explained the consistency of the anomaly. But as she reached the earliest photos from 1963, her blood ran cold, her fingers trembling so badly she nearly dropped the album. In that first Thanksgiving photo, barely visible through the window behind them, stood a dark figure in the garden, watching. Its form was unmistakable against the fresh snow that had fallen that day, and Elena remembered something she'd forgotten for 30 years, how the police had found no footprints in that snow when she'd reported seeing someone outside. She pulled out her magnifying glass, the one she used for examining her stamp collection. Under magnification, each photo revealed more details she wished she hadn't noticed. The figure wasn't just consistent, it was exact, down to the slightly tilted angle of what appeared to be its head, the way its right shoulder seemed to slope just a bit lower than its left. Sharon Williams had always considered herself a rational woman, her background in chemistry leaving little room for superstition. When her mother-in-law called her up to the study that night, voice trembling, she expected to humor another of Eleanor's peculiarities. But as Eleanor laid out photo after photo in precise chronological order, Sharon's scientific mindset began to crumble like ancient parchment. The following morning, she suggested they bring the photos to her colleague, Dr. Young, at the University of Washington's photography department. He was known for debunking paranormal photography, having written several papers on the psychology of pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns where none exist. Over the next week, Dr. Young analyzed the images using every technique available in 1993. Chemical analysis of the developing process, digital scanning, still new technology then, comparison of light patterns, and measurement of anomalies. His laboratory, usually cluttered with equipment and reference materials, grew increasingly Spartan as he removed everything that wasn't directly related to the Williams family photos. Sharon noticed he stopped working after sunset, though he never explained why. When asked about his preliminary findings, he merely shook his head and muttered about impossible consistencies. Finally, after 7 days of analysis, Dr. Young presented his findings. He confirmed no tampering, no double exposure, no camera malfunction across any of the photographs. The figure's dimensions remained consistent across 3 decades. 6'2" inches tall, approximately 18 inches wide at the shoulders, with a peculiar density that could be measured through light absorption rates. Most disturbing was its progression. The shadow grew more solid in each progressive photo, as if it were somehow gaining substance through the years, like a photo slowly developing in reverse. The temperature in Dr. Young's lab seemed to drop as they studied the most recent photo from 1993. The figure now stood among them, between Uncle James and Deborah, its form so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. Yet none of them remembered seeing anything during the photo taking. Dr. Young's final report included an observation he tried to delete later. The subject appears to be gaining mass not through traditional physical means, but through some process of quantum observation. Each viewing, each photograph, seems to strengthen its connection to our reality. Ronald Williams spent his December lunch breaks at the Seattle Public Library, poring over property records that filled box after box in the basement archives. The house on Highland Drive held secrets in its foundations, secrets that seemed to seep up through the floorboards like rising damp. Previous owners had moved out abruptly, often at odd times of year, leaving behind furniture, personal belongings, even family pets. The original owner, Theodore Blackwood, disappeared in 1963, the same year the Williams family moved in, leaving behind a fully furnished house sold at a price that Eleanor had always said was too good to be true. The newspaper archives, stored on microfilm that made Ronald's eyes ache, revealed more. In 1962, Blackwood's wife had vanished after accusing him of bringing something back from his antiquing business trips to Eastern Europe. Their maid reported hearing Mrs. Blackwood scream about something dark that followed her husband home. Theodore had been photographed countless times for social pages. His antique business made him minor Seattle royalty, but in his final year, he refused all photos, claiming they showed things that couldn't be there. Eleanor found her own patterns in town records. Every family that lived in the house before them had taken photos in front of that fireplace. It was built into the sale contract, a bizarre requirement that the family must photograph themselves there annually. The clause was written in archaic legal language that 3 different lawyers had failed to remove from the deed. She tracked down 3 surviving previous owners. None would talk about the house, but one elderly woman in Tacoma, living in a room filled with bright lights and mirrors, just whispered, it wanted to be remembered. It needed to be seen. When Eleanor asked what it was, the woman began covering every reflective surface in her room with sheets, her hands shaking as she worked. Property records before 1920 had been destroyed in a courthouse fire, but Eleanor discovered something else. Every family who had lived in the house had experienced at least one unexplained disappearance, always after exactly 30 years of residence. The Williams family had moved in during the summer of 1963. They were approaching their 30th year. Uncle James hadn't always been the quiet man who lived in the garden cottage. In his youth, he'd been a photographer himself, specializing in architectural documentation. His basement darkroom held decades of work, including detailed photos of the house from when they'd first moved in. The space still smelled of chemical fixatives and stopped time, the red safety light casting bloody shadows across decades of archived negatives. Sharon and Ronald spent a weekend in that musty space, examining negatives and prints through Uncle James's professional light table. The photos were meticulously labeled and dated, showing every angle of the house during its renovation in '63. Among the architectural shots, they found something chilling. In photos of the fireplace's construction, the bricks revealed an unusual pattern when viewed under strong light. When photographed under ultraviolet light, strange symbols became visible, carved into the cornerstone, hidden beneath layers of soot and time. A professor of archaeological linguistics from the Burke Museum identified them as pre-Columbian markings, similar to those used in ritual sites where ancient peoples believed they could capture spirits with primitive cameras of polished obsidian. The symbols roughly translated to, "The lens draws it forth. Each viewing makes it stronger. When it is seen enough, it will be real." The carbon dating of the brick's clay placed its creation centuries before the house's construction, before Seattle's founding. The symbols appeared to be burned into the clay before firing, using a technique that didn't match any known Native American practices in the Pacific Northwest. Uncle James's photos revealed something else. The figure had appeared in architectural shots too, but differently. In these images, it seemed to be emerging from the fireplace itself, like smoke taking shape. The progression was clear, first in the fireplace, then in the room, then in the garden, and finally among them. The family photos hadn't just been documenting the entity's approach. They had been facilitating its manifestation, each flash of light bringing it closer to their reality. Most disturbing was what they found in Uncle James's journal, hidden behind a loose brick in the darkroom wall. The final entry, dated just last week, read, "It's not just in the photos anymore. I see it when I close my eyes. It's waiting for the 30th photo. 30 years, 30 photos, and then it will be ready." As December 1993 drew to a close, the house on Highland Drive grew colder. Space heaters shorted out without explanation. Lights flickered and died, leaving only the fireplace's glow to illuminate the living room. Sharon noticed at first the family photos on the mantel were changing. In each one, no matter when it was taken, the dark figure now stood in the same position, directly behind Eleanor. The family gathered in the study on New Year's Eve, surrounded by decades of research and photographs. Emma, the eldest daughter, had discovered something in her computer class at school. Using new digital scanning technology, she created overlays of all 30 years of photos. The results confirmed their worst fears. The figure's progression wasn't random. It had been moving with mathematical precision, each year bringing it exactly 13.7 inches closer to Elena. Uncle James hadn't emerged from his cottage in 3 days. When Ronald finally broke down the door, they found only his camera, still warm to the touch, and a stack of recently developed photos. Each showed the same image, the fireplace at night, and in front of it, a dark figure standing exactly where Eleanor would be in the next family photo. The final piece clicked when Deborah found Eleanor's original purchase agreement from 1963. Hidden in the legal language was a clause they'd overlooked. The property requires annual documentation of familial presence before the hearth to be completed within the first cycle of 30 years. The deadline wasn't Thanksgiving 1993 as they'd assumed. It was the exact date of their first photo, January 21st, 1964. They had 3 weeks left before the 30th anniversary. Eleanor insisted they leave, but the house seemed to have other plans. Cars wouldn't start. Phone lines went dead. Even the doors appeared to shift in their frames, refusing to open. They were being held there, drawn inexorably toward one final photograph. January 21st, 1994 arrived with an unnatural stillness. The house had stopped making its usual sounds, no creaking floorboards, no rattling pipes, no whistling wind. Eleanor stood before the fireplace alone, her family locked in the study despite Ronald's desperate attempts to break down the door. The Polaroid camera sat on its tripod, waiting. Through the study's keyhole, Sharon watched in horror as Eleanor faced the fireplace. The camera's self-timer began its countdown, each tick echoing like a funeral bell. In the mirrors, in the windows, in every reflective surface, they could see it now, the figure, no longer a mere shadow, but something almost solid, its form composed of countless layers of photographs, 3 decades of forced manifestation coming to fruition. 10 seconds. Eleanor turned to run. 9 seconds. The figure emerged from every photograph on the mantel simultaneously. 8 seconds. The room's temperature plummeted, frost crystallizing on the windows. 7 seconds. Eleanor screamed, but no sound emerged. 6 seconds. The figure stood before her, its form flickering like a film reel. 5 seconds. It reached for her with hands made of captured light and shadow. 4 seconds. The door finally burst open. 3 seconds. Ronald lunged forward. 2 seconds. A blinding flash filled the room. 1 second. Silence. The Polaroid ejected with a mechanical whir, the image slowly developing in the cold air. The family rushed to Eleanor, but she stood perfectly still, staring at the mantel. Every photo had changed. In each one, from 1963 to 1993, Eleanor now stood where the figure had been, while the figure itself stood in her original position. 30 years of memories, rewritten in an instant. The newest photo developed last. It showed the family by the fireplace, smiling their familiar smiles. But Eleanor was missing, and in her place stood a shadow that seemed to stare directly at the viewer, as if aware it would be seen again and again, gaining strength with each viewing, waiting for the next family to move in. They found the camera smashed to pieces the next morning. The photos, however, were gone along with all their research, Uncle James's notes, and any proof of what had happened. Only the final photo remained, tucked into the house's deed, waiting to be discovered by the next owner who would be drawn to the beautiful Victorian home with the strange fireplace, offered at a price that seemed too good to be true. Take a moment tonight to look through your old family photos. Notice anything unusual in the backgrounds, any shadows that seem to follow from picture to picture. Don't forget to subscribe to the Nightmare Maestro's archive and hit that notification bell. There are countless more horrors waiting to be developed in my collection.